Hello and welcome. My name is Caroline Lawton. I'm an associate manager here at the Innovation for Poverty Actions Peace and Recovery Program, and it's our pleasure to host this event today along with our partners at JPAL Europe. This webinar on emerging evidence from business mentorship program in Kampala, Uganda, is the third in a series of webinars hosted by the Displaced Livelihoods Initiative, which is a partnership between JPAL and IPA. The series will share emerging insights from some of the latest research for livelihoods for displaced populations and the communities that host them. The Displaced Livelihood Initiative generates and shares new research on policies and programs that can foster sustainable livelihoods for displaced and host communities. The initiative is generously supported by the IKEA Foundation. Our overall goal is to crowd in new evidence on supporting and creating sustainable livelihoods for displaced populations and host communities, and then connect that evidence with policymakers and practitioners to ensure that it can inform their decision-making. We have 5 priority areas for learning: resilience, wage employment, both formal and informal, entrepreneurship, social cohesion, inclusion, and norms, rights and regulations, recognizing that laws and regulations significantly shape the livelihood trajectories of displaced populations. To date, we funded 50 studies in over 20 countries depicted here. As I mentioned, through this webinar series, we're excited to begin to share with you what we've been learning through our supported research and related projects from our networks of researchers and grantees. And our efforts are part of a much broader global effort to push forward the evidence base on economic inclusion and social protection. It's in part through a multi-stakeholder pledge, the Global Refugee Forum, which was led by the UNHCR and the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. Both IPA and JPAL are part of this pledge. And one of our core pillars is to advance data and evidence on these topics. So we see our work as sitting squarely within this commitment. You can learn more by scanning the QR code on the screen. Today, we're excited to delve into new research on the impacts of business grants and mentorship on refugee entrepreneurship, particularly among refugees living in Kampala, Uganda. I'll leave it mostly to our panelists to better motivate this work, but as you know, Uganda hosts nearly 1.5 million refugees and asylum seekers and offers one of the most progressive environments for refugee economic integration. Microentrepreneurship is a common form of income generation for refugees around the world, but particularly among the 150,000 refugees living in Kampala. However, constraints such as obstacles to borrowing, inexperience, and a lack of managerial capital and networks can limit growth. But new research on IRC's Rebuild program that provided mentorship and cash grants to refugee and host entrepreneurs is shedding light on strategies to address these constraints. We should note that Rebuild was also generously supported by the IKEA Foundation. We're lucky to be joined by 2 panelists who are deeply immersed in this topic. To begin, Thomas Ginn, who's a research fellow at the Center for Global Development, will present his recent RCT that evaluated the impacts of this program on refugees and entrepreneurs in Kampala. And then Martin Musiime, who's a research coordinator for the International Rescue Committee, will share insights on how IRC is applying these lessons to their ongoing work in Uganda and beyond. A few quick housekeeping notes. We will start the presentation from each panelist and then open the floor up for questions from the audience. But if you'd like to ask questions during the event, please use the Q&A function and share your name and affiliation if you're comfortable. That way the panelists know who the questions are coming from. Feel free to ask questions throughout, but we will likely not answer until the end, and we may not be able to get to every question, which we apologize for in advance. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and will be available to watch after the event, and we'd appreciate if you could send the link to any of your colleagues who may be interested. Now I'll pass it over to Thomas, who will kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline, for that fantastic introduction. Let me share my screen here. And then, all right. Can you see me in the slides?
We can see the side slides as well.
Let's see. So you How about that?
The same, but maybe
How about this?
perfect. Great.
Great.
Thanks.
All right. Sorry about that, everybody. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks so much for everybody joining. Thank you so much to the DLI team. A lot of folks behind the scenes, Sydney O'Connell, Ricardo Morel, Nessa Kenny. Really appreciate all the work that you all have done, and excited to be here and share this work. As Caroline said, my name is Thomas Ginn. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Global Development in DC. And we'll be presenting this project that was jointly implemented with the international, that was implemented by the International Rescue Committee as part of the Rebuild project, and is succinctly named right now Cash and Small Business Groups for Ugandans and Refugees. And so this was joint work with a fantastic team of co-authors, Travis Bosler at the University of Rochester, Ibrahim Kassire at the Economic Policy Research Center, Linda Moya at the International Rescue Committee, and Andrew Zeitlin at Georgetown. So before I get started, as Caroline mentioned, we'd like to thank the folks who funded this. The IKEA Foundation funded the Rebuild, a lot of the Rebuild project, and a lot of the research that went into that whole project. And then DLI came in and really supported on a lot of the data collection for this randomized control trial specifically. And so we're very appreciative of that funding, and the views here do not necessarily reflect those of the funders or the authors' organizations. So as Caroline motivated here, microentrepreneurship is a common but often unprofitable livelihood for many people around the world. And so we know that small firms often lack financial and managerial capital in order to be able to expand. And so when large literature in development economics has attempted to target these constraints, we've thought about cash transfers and found that a lot of times these can have positive effects, but the effects are sometimes disappointing, especially for women entrepreneurs. And then if we're targeting the managerial capital constraints, we can think about formal training interventions like business training, vocational training. These are typically expensive, and I think it's fair to say that the literature has found mixed results on these. And so we wanted to look at a different possible intervention, which was mentorship, and by a more experienced business owner in the community. And we think that this could target business practices like accounting and on lending out credit, business networks, and where you get a lot of information that we think are really important, even just a general encouragement mechanism to keep going during difficult times, and then broader knowledge exchange on different technological innovations, different techniques that people are using. And so we think this is going to be important. There's some exciting studies out of Kenya that have shown that this can be profitable for inexperienced business owners. But we think that this could especially be helpful when we're pairing demographics that have fewer business connections. So think about hosts and refugees, or men and women, where there might be a lot of information that's useful to exchange. And so the benefits of cooperation could be even higher, but oftentimes these networks are segregated, as we will get into. And so specifically, this project was designed to look at programs and policies that would help explore how to help refugees integrate. And so as many of you probably know, there's 42 million refugees globally. 2/3 are in protracted situations that have lasted at least 5 years. And so a livelihoods program like this is really important for both refugees' well-being, as well as to reduce the amount of assistance that refugees need in order to be able to survive and to thrive. In addition, this was done in Kampala, the capital city of Uganda, and so refugees increasingly are living in urban areas where it's important to have evidence about specific interventions that could target them. But again, often they're economically and socially segregated. And so we would argue that it's unclear to this point what programs can improve livelihoods. So aid programs, maybe this should say, were increasingly targeted refugees and hosts jointly. Hopefully they still will with the aid cuts that are happening. But there's a lot of evidence among hosts or native populations, and I would argue that it's unclear whether this evidence applies to refugees, that some things that may not be as exciting among hosts might be really valuable for refugees who are just trying to integrate into a new community. And we think that while we're initially targeting economic outcomes, that it's really important to also think about social cohesion, ideally to boost it, but especially not to potentially backfire that can happen in some of these aid programs if some groups get a program when others don't. So I think all these things are important, and what we tried to take into account when we were looking to design this program. So what is the program specifically? This is one part of the larger rebuild project. This is an experiment in Kampala, Uganda. And so we were working with 2,000 inexperienced or prospective entrepreneurs. And this was about half Ugandans, who I'll call hosts in this presentation, and half refugees. Half are men and half are women. And so we've got a balanced sample here to look at different effects within groups. What exactly did we do? Overall, to summarize, we gave cash grants, large cash grants of about $540 to everyone except for the control group. And then within some of the people who got cash grants, some of those folks got a mentorship program. And so broadly, this was 3 of these inexperienced and prospective entrepreneurs who were matched with a mentor from the community. This could be a refugee, a host, a man, or a woman. And we asked them to meet weekly for 6 months. And so some of these groups we'll call aligned groups that were the same gender and the same nationality. Another set of these groups were mixed gender, so 2 men and 2 women of the same nationality. And then a different set were mixed nationality, so 2 Ugandans and 2 refugees. And these were of the same gender. So we've got these 3 types of mentorship groups, 3 different compositions. And then another component that we added into some of the mentorship groups was a shared fate incentive, is what we called it, so that group members felt that they were invested in each other. And so there was a small bonus if their group members did well, in order to try to keep them invested, share different ideas with each other, and potentially overcome some of the difficulties that might come from a mixed nationality or a mixed gender group initially. So that's the broad idea. What did we find? First, we found large positive effects of cash grants on business, household, and social cohesion outcomes that persisted for at least 12 months when we stopped measuring cash against the control. We found actually pretty similar effects for cash between Ugandans and refugees, and somewhat between men and women as well. We think that this is really interesting to add to the literature about livelihoods and its potential impacts on displaced populations. When we look at mentorship, we found positive effects of mentorship for refugee men specifically that were almost as large as the effects of the cash. But surprisingly, we found negative effects among some groups of women. It's null on average, but negative for women in the upper quartile for both refugee and host women. And this is an effect that we're still trying to dig into and understand better. And this is an effect relative to cash. So they still did better because they had some cash, but they would have done better if they had only had the cash, it looks like, than with the added mentorship group. And then the last main finding that we want to convey is we find no evidence at this point that intergroup contact, so mixing nationalities, refugees, and hosts, had any additional effect on social cohesion beyond the cash grants that we labeled in a specific way that I'll talk about. So the contact hypothesis that I think a lot of organizations invest a lot in, we think it's really important to measure this. And in this setting, in our setup, we're not finding any additional boost from the significant effort that we put in to merge Ugandans and refugees together and design programs that brought people together in a persistent way. Great, so now I'll dive more into the setting and the experimental design for some background. As we've said, micro-entrepreneurship is really common. We're dealing with these owner-operated firms that are a common source of livelihood across Africa. As Caroline mentioned, Uganda, the setting that we're working in, has one of the most progressive refugee policies in the world. Refugees are free. They're allowed to work. They're free to live in the capital city. Many refugees, therefore, take advantage of that, and they run these small businesses legally. And we actually find that refugees are slightly more likely to report being registered with the authorities than the host communities. We're talking about refugees from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, Eritrea, South Sudan, Sudan. So many of Uganda's neighbors that have faced conflict in the recent past. And those are all included in our sample. So in our baseline sample, when we look at some of our main characteristics, 70% have businesses starting out, and the other 30% say that they're very interested in owning a business. So the average monthly profits for these folks, they report as $28. This is higher, notably higher for men, $34 than for women. But it's similar for Ugandans and refugees. So this is not a population in part because refugees have been there for a while, because they've been able to integrate with more receptive policies, where the refugees that we're working with on average have at least lower monthly profits, although there's still significant social segregation that we'll talk about. The mentor population that we recruited has profits that are more than double the average profits of our main sample. And so we think these are folks that might have valuable information to convey. And to give you a sense of these people's general socioeconomic outlook, this $28 monthly profit is about 45% of mentees' the total household earnings on average. So again, just to give you a sense, this is one of our clients in Kampala, a small shop that might sell bottled water, toothbrushes, candy, things. And she would be responsible for, she would get the profits or be responsible for any losses that might accrue to this business. And these are, of course, quite common across Africa, and I would say specifically in Kampala for both refugees and hosts. So the motivation of this project is around business networks and how they're often segmented. And so to give some background data on this, we asked people about their 3 closest business contacts. And so we break this down in the columns by the demographic of people that are responding. So we asked people for their 3 closest business contacts, and you can see in the first row that Ugandan men on average reported 2.1 contacts out of 3. Ugandan women, slightly fewer at 1.9, refugee men, fewer still at 1.4, and then refugee women, the least at 1.2 contacts when they could have given us a maximum of 3. This is similarly reflected in the percentage that lists no contacts at all the way up to 44% of refugee women are not listing any close business contacts. And then when we dive into those networks further, we see that Ugandan men are most likely to list Ugandan men as their close business contacts. And within demographic groups, they're most likely to list that demographic. So Ugandan women, 69% are listing other Ugandan women as their contacts, more likely to list Ugandan men, and then very few Ugandan women or Ugandan men are listing refugees. And then in the last 2 columns, refugee men are most likely to list refugee men. A few more list Ugandan men, so there's a little bit of overlap. But in general, we see a lot of evidence here that networks are quite segmented by both gender and by nationality. To give a few more details on the program, all of the treatment arms, excluding the control, received a cash grant of $540 US. So this is large in this setting. It's a year and a half of the average profits that we're talking about. We had a launch event where we announced this cash grant, and then that would be transferred about 6 weeks later via mobile money. That was to give people time to plan what they would do with it, and for those in mentorship groups, time to discuss with their groups what might be the best strategies. And so we told people that we were hoping that this would be invested in their business in productive economic activities, but we told people that there was going to be no enforcement mechanism. We think that most people, we can see in the in the data that most people were more than happy and wanted to invest this in their businesses. Among those people who got cash grants, among some of those people, I should say, there we assign mentorship groups. And again, this is 3 mentees and 1 mentor. We asked them to meet weekly for 6 months, but again, there's no enforcement of this. And this was then, we passed this off to be led by the mentor. So we randomly assign them to the mixed gender, the mixed nationality, or these aligned groups that we talked about. We included videos and handbooks that had a curriculum and discussion questions to spur some of the conversation within these groups. The mentors received a smaller payout of $270 after the 6 weeks, and then $54 at the end to keep people invested. And then we also hosted monthly meetings with the mentors to see how things were going and to try to help them facilitate groups. So somewhat of a training of the trainers model. And then we did this, what we called the shared fate component with part of the mentorship groups, where this lottery-based component had differing incentives across the treatment arms. So everybody in the cash or the mentorship arms would receive a ticket that was whether they reported being open. If your ticket was drawn, you won $20 for having an open business that was then be spot checked before we paid out. And we did this 3 times after the 2, 4, and 6 month intervals. So for some of the groups, this was individualized. If you had an open business, you got $20. For the shared fate folks, this was done at the group level. So if anyone in your group had an open business, you then you got paid out. So if your fellow mentee had an open business, but you didn't, and they won the lottery, then you also would win the lottery. And so you had an incentive to invest, to share maybe information that you thought was somewhat proprietary, to invest and encourage your fellow group members that we thought would, again, help people bridge the gap between different nationalities. And so we're looking at folks who are 18 to 35 years old with less than 6 years of experience, who said they were willing to spend 20 hours a week on their business and 3 hours a week on the program, who had some similarities in ability to communicate. We launched this in late 22, and then we followed people 3, 6, 9, and 12 months later, in addition to 24 months after the control group had already received, after 18 months, a cash grant. All right, so let me dive into the results. So first, we find these large impacts of cash on both business and household outcomes. So the dark blue panel, blue bar, is going to be the cash group, and the lighter blue bar is going to be the control group that through these first 12 months had not received the cash grant. And so in the top left panel, this is monthly profits, and you can see that the control group on average had about $40 profit, and that was about 50% larger on average among the groups who got any cash. And so this is quite statistically significant and persistent that I'll talk about in a second. This is also reflected a lot of the grant went straight to capital stock. And so we can see that this money was invested. Again, more than 50% increase on average in the capital stock that folks are keeping and able to yield a return to capital here. We see that more people are owning businesses. A large number more people that have gotten the cash grant have started businesses after the program. We then, on the bottom panel, see positive effects on psychological outcomes, like feeling sad part of the time. This number decreases in the cash group. Household earnings overall go up, so we see the increase in profits pass through to household earnings, and there's no sort of substitution here. And then food security, in addition, we see significant decreases in the number of days that the household has to skip a meal, for instance. So overall, large positive impacts of cash on business and household outcomes. When we look at mentorship, and break this down a little bit more by the demographic groups, overall, we see that mentorship increased profits for refugee men relative to cash, but different findings for Ugandan men and for women overall. So first, I'm going to show you quite a few graphs like this that have the effects on the vertical axis. And so this is the comparison of the control group to the treatment group. So on the far left, the blue bar is the cash-only group who didn't have any mentorship among Ugandan men. And we can see that this effect, they got about $23 on average more profit than the control group. Next to that, the red bar is the red box is the Ugandan men who had any sort of mentorship. And it's slightly higher, but not by very much. And so it doesn't seem like mentorship is doing a whole lot for Ugandan men. Then if we move to refugee men, you can see that the effect of cash is quite similar. The blue bar is basically in the same place, but the effect of mentorship is almost double. And so we see that mentorship for refugee men was quite powerful and seemed to yield a lot of gains, at least in terms of profit. For Ugandan women, we see that, again, the effects for the blue box were about the same, a little bit lower maybe than men. But for mentorship, this is even a little bit below the cash-only effect, above the control group, above 0, but lower than the cash-only group. And we see a similar pattern reflected among refugee women that we found really surprising, especially because we were hoping this mentorship was in part ways designed to get over that finding that oftentimes cash was less effective among women. It's not what we find here. Instead, we find that the component we tried to add to help women, make more use of the cash, in some ways had the opposite effects that are marginally significant that we anticipated. We find that these effects are more persistent for men on business impacts. So the green is mentorship, the blue is cash. And so we see that the green for Ugandan men, again, not a whole lot of difference between the cash and the mentorship. And so up to 12 months there in the middle of the top left panel, we see that these effects are statistically significant for Ugandan men in both mentorship and cash. Again, the far panel at 24 months, or sorry, the far dots at 24 months, we had already treated the control group, so we can't actually tell whether these effects persisted of cash only, but the difference with mentorship and cash isn't there. For refugee men, you could see this effect where the green line is above the blue line, that mentorship was more effective, and this was persistent through 12 months. And then for Ugandan and refugee women, we see more effects at the beginning that are less persistent as we get to the 12-month follow-up and beyond. Overall, for women, though, and for men, the effects persist on a lot of the household outcomes, just not for the business outcomes through the 12-month survey. I mentioned that we find different effects among sort of different groups of profitability. So men, you could see that cash grants are most effective for the most profitable men, and women as well. In the top right panel, it's most of the largest gains. There's gains to everybody, but the largest gains are coming to women who were at the highest point in the profit distribution. But if you look at the mentorship quantile plot here, in the far right, bottom right, on the far right side, the women who were doing the best, that's furthest to the right, are the ones where this negative effect is most pronounced. And we're, again, still digging into why that's the case, but it's a pretty precise 0 for women, anything before, for women who were less profitable or didn't own a business, so that we're not seeing a boost even among sort of women whose businesses were not as strong at the beginning. So we see that actually a lot of this effect was concentrated among women mentors. So on the right side panel, the yellow bars, the yellow boxes are the female mentors that are below the male mentors. We're not sure if this is an effect that is specific to women. It could be other characteristics that we're diving into more. And then on the left-hand side, the comparison between the red and the green boxes show that actually the Ugandan and refugee mentors, there's not a lot of difference for Ugandans, and there's not a lot of difference for refugees. Maybe a little bit higher for Ugandan mentors, but that's not statistically significant. We find overall that the shared fate incentive to bring these groups together and give them a component to align with each other even more was actually sort of backfired in these aligned groups. So the incentive created either more tension or something like that. And this is reported that aligned groups see lower profits while the program is still going on. They're less likely to listen to questions. They're less likely to think their group is working hard. So again, when there is the same gender and same nationality. This pattern is actually reversed for mixed groups that are a little bit worse at the beginning or a little bit worse without the incentives, but the shared fate component that brings people together improves that somewhat. And so we see this as incentives might be some kind of substitute to bring people together and overcome some potential differences at baseline and invest in each other quite quickly, but still more work to be done there. On the social cohesion side, we find first, when we look at just the cash, we find a marginally positive effect of just cash on Ugandans that are more likely to report things like willingness to have refugees as a neighbor, things like that. So social cohesion, less likely to report that refugees have a negative impact culturally on Uganda. Things like that are included in our index. So the blue box is the cash only. When we look at the red box, which is now the groups that were mixed between Ugandans and refugees, if anything, the contact that Ugandans had with refugees makes them less likely than the cash only group to say that they were willing to have refugees as neighbors, that kind of thing. So again, not the effect that we might have anticipated or that the contact hypothesis might suggest, but we think is an important finding for policy. Refugees, we don't see many effects on the social cohesion outcomes at all, and we see on the far right side that most of these effects are coming from women more than men. When we look at effects on policy views, so whether hosts feel that refugees should have the right to work, freedom of movement, things like that, we can see that the cash, it's similar pattern. Cash was really important for Ugandans feeling like, yes, we were happy for refugees to have these political, these policy inclusive measures, and the mixed nationality groups that brought people together weekly, if anything, dulled that effect. So again, the cash still came through, but the mixed groups on top of the cash really did not add anything else, and if anything, muted that effect. And so what do we think explains this? At the beginning of the project, the handbook that we had included a line about aid sharing and about the origins of the program. And so it says that the IRC started this program because refugees live here in Kampala, and we want both refugees and Ugandans who live in Kampala to benefit. So emphasizing here that refugees and Ugandans are getting this program. And then goes on to say this project is part of the international donations that are shared between refugees and hosts. In Uganda, 30% of foreign donations for refugees go to supporting Ugandans. So emphasizing that the donations are coming from the refugee assistance and not the other way around, that not refugees are taking money that would otherwise be available for Ugandans, but refugees, some of the assistance from the international community, Ugandans are benefiting from. And in our previous work, Travis and mine and other co-authors, we test this impact of just the labeling, of just adding this message to cash, and find that that has a really significant impact on the cash grants that we replicate here. And we've also replicated it across large and small grants, across urban and rural Kenya, across large and small refugee populations. So I encourage you to check that work out as well. So overall, to wrap up here, a brief summary of what we've talked about, that we see large and roughly uniform impacts of these relatively large cash transfers on business profits across Ugandan men, refugee men, Ugandan women, refugee women, we think are really important. It's the largest effects are coming from the most profitable businesses. So it's helpful when refugees are already successful, but helpful really across the distribution as well. But we're not seeing that, refugees needed to have these host business networks before they were able to take advantage of this cash. And so similar findings for refugees and Ugandans in this context. And then for mentorship, we find that this positive effect for refugee men, that's especially coming from refugee men who had fewer networks at baselines. We think there is something to this networks story. So bringing refugee men together and possibly learning from either refugees or Ugandans is quite helpful. But then this quite puzzling finding among women that we're still digging into. Some of the things we've looked at, we don't see any differences by things like childcare obligations, that taxation by the mentors, or differences in terms of encouragement of going into different sectors. And so still probing there. But for now, this mentorship costs an additional $350 per client to deliver on top of the additional costs that mentees were incurring for the time that they spent. And so not really sort of slam dunk evidence that we would want to scale up mentorship quite yet without more research. And so then to wrap up, where do we see sort of policy and practical implications from this work? So for livelihood programs for entrepreneurs, we would certainly argue that a base of cash is really important, and then other things that we would want to try, like we did in this project with mentorship, important to study and to do things, at least to be monitoring outcomes, if not in a randomized setting like this, to really understand the complex effects that we're seeing here. We think that we just need more studies overall to compare effects from hosts and refugees and to see how well the wider literature among natives translates to refugees. And then this labeling that I talked about for where the assistance is coming from, especially when host communities are getting some of this assistance, we think is a really cost-effective, powerful, easy idea for organizations to implement. And we'd love to talk about more if folks are interested. For mentorship, I didn't mention, but we see actually across demographics that mentors who are running a more successful business are helping their mentees to get more profit. So screening in these mentors seems to be really valuable if we're going to run mentorship. But intergroup contact was really complicated to implement. And we see a lot of organizations trying to do this, but it yields kind of minimal results in our setting, at least. And again, important to study. And again, our sort of puzzling result on female mentees, we think is really important to look at here on potential adverse effects and to monitor as any program would move forward. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for your time. Looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Now we're going to hand it over to David, who will tell us a bit more about applying these lessons.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you, Thomas. Greetings to everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this presentation and discussion of this paper on cash and small business groups for Ugandans and refugees. As already introduced, my name is David Martin Musiime, the research coordinator for the review program at the International Rescue Committee, and I'm joining in from Kampala. So I'm happy to add my thoughts and reflections on this important research and its implications on our work at the IRC and also for refugee livelihoods more broadly. I will share my thoughts around 4 key areas. The first one is the major programmatic takeaways. Why is this evidence relevant for programming? And then also share thoughts on how, as the review program and the IRC, we've adopted this evidence to our interventions and our research, and then also briefly share thoughts on some open questions that we still need to answer. This evidence has triggered a lot of questions, and I'll share some thoughts around those ones that we need to answer, and lastly look at some context-specific aspects for generalizing this evidence. If we want to look at it beyond the context in which the study was implemented, what we should put into consideration. So straight to the major programmatic takeaways, I want to begin by saying that this paper comes as part of the reviews program's evidence and learning, where we use RCTs to evaluate our program interventions and generate evidence on what works, what doesn't work, and how much it costs to provide services for urban refugees in order to contribute to their self-reliance and economic inclusion in a meaningful way. So we use this evidence ourselves as a program to adapt our services so that we can make them stronger and achieve better outcomes for our clients. So the findings from this paper are from our first wave of RCTs. We also have a second wave, but today we are talking about the first wave. So these findings give us powerful insights into effective interventions for refugee self-reliance and economic inclusion. So the first programmatic takeaway I want to highlight is the glaring one, that cash grants are the game changer. So from this evidence, we've seen that these cash grants deliver large, persistent, positive impacts on business outcomes and overall household well-being, which also includes enhanced food security, increased assets, and higher savings, like we've seen. And they also significantly improve psychological well-being. We also found that these cash grants are highly cost-effective strategy for boosting micro enterprise success and social cohesion. So to speak briefly on as an example, on the programmatic side, the cost per client for implementing the cash grants intervention was about $881, which is significantly less than the cost for implementing the cash plus mentorship intervention, which was $1,200 cost per client. So this makes a compelling case for prioritizing cash assistance. Then we've also seen that these cash grants act as a catalytic force for business formation. So in addition to this evidence that we're seeing from this first wave RCT, our wave to RCT, the early insights that we have seen are showing us that over 60% of participants had operational businesses within just 3 months of getting the business grant. And over half of the businesses that we verified as a part of that process were launched after the grant payout. So this gives us strong evidence that these cash grants are a catalytic force for business formation. We've also seen that a significant portion of cash was directly invested in businesses. So this demonstrates that the participants, when given direct capital, largely use it for entrepreneurial purposes. And then the final interesting point that we've seen from what Thomas shared is these cash grants also had a positive impact on social cohesion among Ugandans and improved policy attitudes towards the refugees. So the second programmatic takeaway, this is on mentorship, and it's the one which is more interesting. We are saying that mentorship requires critical re-evaluation and probably redesign. So from our findings, from this specific mentorship design, which we implemented, have showed us mixed and negative results when combined with the cash grants. So for most participants, it did not significantly improve economic outcomes beyond the impact of cash alone. Then another critical finding was the negative profit reduction experienced by the mentored women, especially those that were mentored by other women compared to those who only received cash. And then as a detail on this, for the 25% more profitable women-owned businesses, mentorship actually inhibited their growth. So this highlights that some mentorship designs could be unfavorable. Then we have some exception of refugee men who did experience additional positive effects on their income and from the mentorship. And then lastly, on the mentorship is that in this design, which we implemented it, we saw limited effects on expanding business networks or improving social cohesion beyond what the cash alone achieved or delivered. So the second area I'm sharing my thoughts on in this discussion is on how this evidence informs IRC or the rebuild programming and research. So the results themselves are a wake-up call for how we design livelihoods programs. At the IRC and specifically within the rebuild program, we continually use evidence to adapt our services to achieve the best results for our clients. So we've seen the null effects of mentorship on social, on the social and the network outcomes from this wave one. And these ones indicated that we need to shift from the structured business training through mentorship to a more intensive and deliberate focus on expanding social and business networks. And this is the focus of our Wave 2 RCT. So we have picked on evidence that we can develop on in the second wave of the RCTs. So we are now, as an organization and as a program, also prioritizing interventions that are gender sensitive, explicitly recognizing and addressing the significant labor market, social, cultural barriers that particularly block women, especially refugee women, from economic gains. So this means being deliberate and tailoring support to their unique needs. As an organization also, we are also refining our mentorship initiatives. So emphasizing the need to critically assess the design of these programs, the selection of the mentors, and gender dynamics more broadly to ensure positive outcomes for all the groups, and especially the women. And overall, this research reinforces the importance of inclusive, evidence-based policies and strong cross-sector collaboration to enable refugees to transition from being recipients of aid to active contributors to the societies that are hosting them. Then we come to the open questions that we still need to answer. So as we've noted earlier, the takeaways are very clear from this evidence. However, there are several important questions that remain to guide future research and program development. So I thought about this from about 5 areas for consideration. The first one is on long-term impact and sustainability. So it's very clear that these medium-term benefits, but we need more investigation into their long-term sustainability and impact, particularly for women. So an example question that we can consider here is, will this initial business formation that is backed by these cash grants translate into sustained growth over many years? The second area is on optimizing mentorship. So how can mentorship programs be redesigned to effectively cater for the diverse demographics? Again, emphasizing the women here, and to ensure that they provide tangible benefits that justify their costs. We've seen the additional cost of mentorship, which was significant, and what specific mentor characteristics or approaches are more effective. Then we also need to understand why mentorship in the form that we tested it in this study negatively impacted women's profits. So this is an area for further research, and we are already looking into it as the Rebuild program. I'll also mention something or some thoughts on network effects. So our Web2 RCT, like I've mentioned, is directly addressing this by exploring what kinds of business and social networks are most impactful for improving livelihood outcomes and social inclusion beyond just cash. So with this, we are eager to see if externally facilitated networks add value to the cash grants. Then there's also this bit of beyond microenterprise. This evidence that we've seen today and other sector evidence shows that microenterprise might not be the sole solution for all individuals or all groups. So we need to explore expanded labor market opportunities beyond self-employment that cater for a broader range of skills and aspirations for the refugees and the host community members. And then finally, addressing the why. So we've seen what happened with the mentorship in this study. When the results came out, it created some turbulence within the program for us as well. And as a result of that, we decided as the Rebuild program, with support from our funding partner, the IKEA Foundation, to conduct a follow-up qualitative study to address the why question. So this qualitative study, which we are currently undertaking, aims to unpack the reasons behind the observed demographic and business capacity differences in the outcomes as far as this mentorship is concerned. So the evidence from this qualitative will provide the crucial depth that we need to understand these differences in these outcomes and to understand the mentorship outcomes better. So thirdly is the content specific aspects when it comes to generalizing these findings beyond the refugee urban context of Kampala. So there are 2 things that I want to emphasize that we consider while thinking about this. And the first one is the unique nature of the rebuild program itself, and also Uganda's progressive refugee policy that we have heard about and also read about extensively. First, on the policy itself, Uganda is widely considered to be a generous policy environment for refugees. We've heard that we know they have the right to work, they have the right to own businesses, they have the right to freedom of movement and so on. But this is something that would be different for the other contexts that are more restrictive. So we need to think about that possibly the higher likelihood of refugees starting businesses in Uganda and their ability to employ Ugandans could influence how interventions, especially these cash grants, translate into economic benefits and social cohesion. And then the aspect of the urban context. So the rebuild program is an urban livelihoods program that focuses on urban refugees in Kampala and also in Nairobi. So we know these urban markets heavily rely on interpersonal relationships and informal exchange, where strong networks are crucial. But these networks are lacking for refugees. So interventions designed in urban settings might have different outcomes in the rural or the camp or settlement settings, so which have got different distinct economic structures and social dynamics. Then we have got another issue on vulnerability and immediate needs that I also wanted to reflect on. Our study population is economically vulnerable, we know that, and many recipients use part of their grants for immediate basic needs, like food and rent. We saw this in wave 1, and we're also seeing it in wave 2. And it indicates the consistent geo pressure of survival and entrepreneurship. So this highlights that in contexts that will have high levels of humanitarian need, business grants may actually in part also function as consumption grants. And this is a reality that we have to think about and consider in other contexts and potentially advocate for a combination of business and consumption grants. And then lastly, is the initial business landscape of participants. So we've seen that the benefits of the cash grants were most pronounced among the larger, moderately profitable businesses. So this suggests that the initial business capacity and entrepreneurial experience of the target population at baseline would significantly influence the scale of the impact that we observe in other contexts. So this is also something that we learn from here that we need to think about as we are looking at applying this evidence elsewhere. And then to conclude, our research provides a very clear-cut evidence on the power of the cash grants as a direct, cost-effective, and transformative tool for fostering microentrepreneurship and enhancing well-being, social cohesion among the refugees and hosts. With the mentorship in its current form, we are seeing that it requires some critical redesign, especially to ensure equitable benefits for women. And our commitment as the rebuild program is to continuously learn from the evidence and adapt this to our interventions in order to improve the outcomes for all the groups. So on the policy side, the evidence to policy is a collaborative journey. We know that this requires dialogue between the researchers, the policymakers, the practitioners, and the donors. So our findings from this first wave paracity and the early insights from wave 2 that we'll publish and share on our website soon are not just academic results, they are actionable evidence. So they are compelling us to rethink and sharpen our interventions, ensuring they are gender sensitive, they are context aware, and prioritize evidence-backed approaches that enable refugees to become effective, rather to become active and self-reliant contributors to the economies that host them. So my final point here is that right now, we have got sufficient evidence to inform tangible policy changes. So these policy changes are crucial to improve the refugees' self-reliance and livelihoods. So in our different capacities, I would make a call that we use this evidence, we use these insights to forge a meaningful future for the refugees across East Africa and beyond. So I'll end my discussion and reflections there and pass back to Caroline. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was so helpful. We got quite a few questions in the chat, and I see Thomas is answering many of them. I may start with passing it back to you, Thomas. I think we saw quite a few questions around the impact of mentorship on women. And if you could speak a bit to how we should apply the lessons from that.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Caroline. Yeah, I think so. The impact on women again was mostly null, except at the top end of the distribution, where it still wasn't negative. It was just less positive than cash alone. So I think that suggests that cash seemed to be, at least in our setting, just a more cost-effective intervention for women than mentorship. We're exploring some hypotheses. I put some in the chat around whether mentorship led other like pressured women to go into less profitable sectors. We don't see a lot of evidence preliminarily for that, whether mentors might have enacted some sort of tax on mentees, whether they might have felt threatened by some mentees, whether there were any childcare burdens. We don't see any differences between women who had children and those who didn't. And there's also been a couple questions about qualitative research that we also had, but women report actually that they really appreciated these groups and thought that they were very helpful. So that doesn't lead us, it's not fully consistent with the empirical evidence that we're seeing. So we would say it's still an open question. We're trying to dig into, I would just say last part, more broadly, not just cutting by refugees and hosts, women and men, but more what characteristics are most predictive of some of these impacts that might actually not come down at the end of the day when we finish this project on just gender or refugee status, as we've done the preliminary cut here, and that might be more predictive overall. So I would say stay tuned and keep doing research in other great contexts and partners. Thanks.
Thank you. And then maybe over to you, David. What are your thoughts on, so you mentioned this, you touched on this a bit, but I think there were some questions around applying these results in terms of IRC's decision-making about future programming when it comes to mentorship and mentor selection, as well as, the decision-making process that went into this program on how mentors were selected. And maybe Thomas, that you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, so in terms of application of these results to future programming, especially the mentorship component, what we have seen on the mentorship, what the mentorship results themselves are. But what we have learned from that, I think are two things that I can probably speak about. One is the mentor selection insights. So we've seen the research indicates that while this mentorship showed these mixed results, there was also some considerable heterogeneity in the added benefit of mentorship. So specifically, we found that the mentors with the higher baseline profits significantly improved mentees' business outcomes. So this highlights the importance of screening for example, more profitable mentors to potentially improve business outcomes for these business mentorship programs. And then the part of redefining the mentorship models themselves, this is also critical. And we'll have to pay specific and very close attention to this, especially the gender dynamics and the mentor selection. So like I've mentioned in the why part of what needs to be done, the extra research that needs to be done, we are looking at some of these reasons that formed the differences in the observed results that we've seen. So in our qualitative follow-up study, be able to pick up some of these things and explain them further and be able to provide very clear recommendations to practitioners on how the IRC can redefine the mentorship model.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Thomas, our last minute.
Sure. I would just say that mentorship we've seen has just been hard, whether it's intergroup contact or not, men and women or not. It was a lot of time and effort, especially in the context of a randomized controlled trial that needed to be very controlled. But even outside of that, I think it's tough to get right. And so I welcome much more research on it, but I think we should move cautiously with that model overall. Again, the positive effects on refugee men are really encouraging. So, but it was tough. I think we might have considered something more like additional training of mentors and helping them beforehand, maybe more involvement with the implementing organization. We try to take a very hands-off approach to save some costs here. But you can imagine a model, if we're trying to change something to spread those benefits more widely, that there's a little bit more sort of systematic involvement in the groups, maybe expanding groups. There's a lot of different dimensions that could be explored around mentorship, and I think should be before we give up on it completely. But my constant plea for more research.
Great. Thank you both so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We really, really appreciate your time, attention, and thoughtful questions. You can keep up with the Displaced Livelihoods webinar series, the link shared on this slide. As I mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be emailed to you. You can also find it on our website at this link. If you have any questions that didn't get answered today, please feel free to email it to us at displacement@povertyaction.org, and we can pass it along to our presenters to help answer those questions. Thank you so much again, both David and Thomas, as well as the whole DLI team. We really appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everybody.